Hi everyone, welcome to Matterhorn. Last time we discussed the Elder Scrolls 6, I provided an overview of the changes I believe that Bethesda needs to make. These changes would ensure that the Elder Scrolls 6 is a successful game in what will be a new generation of consoles. You can check out that video here. But it was several broad ideas such as using a new engine, more NPCs, bigger cities, and things like that. These are big picture things that encompass many smaller but equally important components. For example, I previously suggested that quests needed to be overhauled a bit, but some of the things that you do in quests require you to explore caves, crypts, and ruins within the game world. Because there is some nuance between all of those, we will cover them separately. Broadly, however, let me give you my opinion on Bethesda's approach and how I think they can make each of these areas of the game more engaging and, well, better. When discussing caves, crypts, and ruins in Skyrim, we need to admit that they are almost always extremely linear. By that, I mean they present you with what is essentially just one path forward. In underground areas, this is especially egregious. There may be a branching path, but it typically ends very shortly, and then the player is forced to backtrack. In ruins, which in many cases are above ground, linearity is less prevalent, but still there's usually a clear path forward. My main complaint here is that linear, confined spaces go entirely against what a Bethesda open-world game promises to deliver. The mantra of go anywhere and do anything is almost exclusively confined to the overworld map. Once you get to a specific location, the linearity sets in. Being non-linear for non-linearity's sake isn't what I am advocating for here either. A good mix of linear and non-linear locations is likely the way to go here. But some locations by default should be more non-linear, as that is what would be realistic within a lived-in world. Creating non-linear, smaller areas is the next logical step for the series. It is the perfect evolution for the Bethesda formula, and one that Bethesda needs to embrace. A quick note about linearity and why it is important. As I discussed in a previous video, the game of the future is all about player choice. I can choose where I want to go, but once I get there, I am forced down a series of corridors. How is it that every branching pathway is conveniently collapsed, right? In Skyrim, this wasn't so much of an issue because you spend most of your time in those areas either in combat or looting. I would argue that exploration, a key component of the overworld, should also be a key component of the underground as well. If I am Bethesda, instead of building the areas around a quest, I believe what they need to do is, like a city, build the areas as if people lived in them and built them for a purpose. They do this with some of the castles or stronghold areas in Skyrim, which are in many cases the least linear areas, coincidentally, but it also applies to natural areas like caves. I'll cover caves more in a minute. The first thing I covered in my Elder Scrolls 6 for a new generation video was that Bethesda has to use a new engine. Watching the NoClip documentary on Bethesda, it became clear that the tools Bethesda has at their disposal limit what they can create. Todd Howard goes out of his way to talk about how extremely limited the tools for developers to build cave systems in Oblivion were. He was proud that they had much more creative freedom in Skyrim's caves. Now, a new engine will allow them to take it to the next level. Here's how each area in the Elder Scrolls 6 can be dramatically improved. A cave system in real life is nearly always an incredibly complex system of corridors and open spaces. Caves are the single biggest area of opportunity in the Elder Scrolls 6. In any Elder Scrolls game, there are hundreds of caves waiting to be explored. They are filled with all kinds of animals, bandits, vampires, trolls, and more. But somehow, they are all incredibly linear. Imagine finding a cave entrance that puts you into an area like Blackreach in Skyrim. It was a vast open area that took hours to explore. And I believe that is why that is one of the favorite subterranean areas of the game for many Skyrim fans. Take a look at this picture I found of the Mammoth Cave system from Science Traveler. Notice all of the branching paths and how the cave intersects at many points. These areas run above and below each other. Bethesda's caves are more like mines in the real world, but even those have numerous branching paths. Bethesda doesn't even need to create these cave systems from scratch. They could acquire the already established 3D models of existing real-world cave networks to model their in-game caves. This isn't any different from using real-world cities to create in-game cities. I would love the opportunity to explore areas like this in a new Elder Scrolls game. Bethesda could still populate them with all of the same types of enemies and incorporate quests into their design. It is perfectly fine that players may spend hours exploring. make the areas visually interesting, and it is something I think players will embrace like they do exploring in the overworld. Crypts are an example of locations that can be more linear. By definition, these are burial chambers, therefore they are man-made. They almost always reside underground, so Bethesda can maintain the Draugr presence that they like, but these areas shouldn't just be a series of corridors with spots for Draugr to be hiding. There is potential for so much more here. Looking at real-world crypts built over the centuries would be a good starting point. In fact, the key component here, I believe, is for Bethesda to incorporate far more visual variety in their crypts. In Skyrim, if you explored one crypt, you essentially explored them all. Rudimentary traps triggered by floor plates gave the player the token challenge needed to not just rush through, but there's so much more potential here, even if it is just visual. The feeling of exploring a linear area that looks decidedly different from the last one makes it at least more interesting from a player's perspective. Crypts are the one place that Bethesda can incorporate those areas that, for story or gameplay purposes, must be linear. In Skyrim, my favorite places to explore were dormer ruins. These included technology from long ago, harder enemies to fight, and much more visual variety than either caves or crypts did. They were usually longer with a few more branching paths to explore, if even for a short time. The puzzles in these areas were the best in the game, although, that isn't saying much. In The Elder Scrolls VI, Bethesda has the opportunity to create vast underground ruins modeled in the way a real city would be. Rather than create corridors linking larger ruins should be created in the same way that Bethesda creates cities. A ruin is simply an area from long ago. However, it should still share all of the same traits that a once lived-in city would incorporate. This style of game design is different, because you create the area first, and then someone else has to build a quest or story around it. I also know that developers fear that by building huge areas that players can explore, then players may miss interesting features or choose not to see them. But that isn't any different than many of the other interesting places in the overworld. If I am exploring the underground ruins of a Dwemer city, the layout should be as a city would be. A market area, places to live, manufacturing centers, government buildings, and more. I may entirely miss the market, but someone else may miss the residential area. There is nothing wrong with that. Within these wide open, non-linear areas, there should be enemies that are just too hard to defeat early on. This gives you a reason to return to the same area once again. To help with this, Bethesda needs to incorporate some kind of tracking system, maybe on the map, showing you areas you've explored but not cleared. And then, within that area while you were there, give you some kind of indicator as to how much of it you've explored, maybe by a percentage. Zelda Breath of the Wild has something like this, in that there's a simple percentage indicator on the bottom left side of the map screen showing you how much of the map you've explored. Going further, Bethesda could incorporate a 3D map system similar to what Retro Studios created for the Metroid Prime series. You could manipulate this map in real time, and it made traversal of these interconnected non-linear areas much easier and more satisfying. Just knowing that in some vast subterranean city or cavern that I still have another 30% to discover would really lend to a sense of exploration. Exploration is my favorite part of the Elder Scrolls games, so it makes sense to expand it to areas that were previously very linear. The idea that I could stumble across a cave entrance only to discover a huge cave system that would take me days to explore is exciting. Bethesda can fill it with whatever they want. In the real world, humans leave behind all kinds of evidence of their occupation. This can be drawings, tools, treasure, or in the caves of Wadi Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. With The Elder Scrolls VI, Bethesda has the opportunity to make their beloved series relevant to an entirely new generation of gamer. By the time it releases, there will be millions of gamers that have never even played a true Elder Scrolls title. Their expectations will be much higher than those of us who grew up with the series. That alone should be reason enough for Bethesda to take the next necessary steps in creating a truly believable world that begs to be explored both above and below. Next time, we will be discussing how cities and towns in The Elder Scrolls VI will need to change and how they can be improved. Thanks for watching.